So I was thinking it's Friday, and I'm so happy you're here because I think one of the best things we can think about on a Friday night is the fun things that we want to do outdoors on the weekend. And after this conversation, I'm assuming we're all going to also do fun things outdoors and as good stewards of the outdoors that we get to experience. We live in such a wonderful natural playground, and so this is a really neat opportunity to talk with both of you. So first, I'm going to introduce Morgan Easton on the far side. Morgan is president of the Ridgeline Outdoor Collective, which originated in 2013 as the Rochester Area Sports Trails Alliance, otherwise known as RASTA, so I think a lot of people are familiar with the organization from that name. Initially, those efforts from Ridgeline were centered on backcountry skiing and really with that use of public and private lands. The members of the organization have also really broadened their focus over the years. So now they're really looking to create multi-use trails for hiking, running, snowshoeing, my personal favorite, cross-country skiing, as well as mountain biking. The collective aims to create a sustainable trail and glade network connecting both private and public lands, and the mission is to provide safe and sustainable multiple-use trails for the enjoyment of area residents and visitors. So welcome. We're happy to have you here. Next, yes, welcome. Next, we have Kattie Eddington, and Kattie is with the Upper Valley Trails Alliance, and they do a lot of work in my backyard for real, and so I have a deep appreciation. We were talking a lot about the work that happens right in my town recently, so that's very nice. Kattie, though, grew up in Salt Lake City, really started to enjoy the outdoors and all the national parks in her home state early on. In college, also used to really enjoy going to the canyon lands in the Southwest, and I actually grew up in New Mexico, so I also can relate to that. We discovered we had a lot of parallels, which was also fun to learn. Kattie continues, so she started to work, I'll back up a little bit. She started to work in 2013 with Mill Hollow Outdoor Education Center back in Utah, which is a residential cabin counselor where she worked to help children in Salt Lake City foster a love of the outdoors. And she's really continuing that work now with the Upper Valley Trails Alliance. So Kattie manages the Passport to Winter Fund program. And this is an incentive program for kids, really K through 6, to be physically active in the winter. And my kids are now 18 and 20, but my kids did the Passport to Winter Fun when they were little. And it's awesome because they get this passport and they really do these fun things and they get these little stamps and stuff that go with the passport. So it's really amazing. So thank you for that. Yes. And she also coordinates really the 3 main annual events that the Alliance puts on. And so that's the Tour de Taste. So if you like to bike ride and you also want to eat really good food in the Upper Valley, highly recommend it. There's also the Skate-a-thon that happens in Lake Maury. Has it already happened this year?
No, we had to cancel it.
We need more ice. We need more ice and snow. And then also the Stoked Trail Race. So the other thing I'm going to share that Kattie gave me permission to share is I think one of the most interesting facts, which is that her middle name really is Danger, which is spectacular. So welcome, Kattie. I know, wouldn't you want that to be your middle name? I mean, mine is Anne, and now I'm like, well. So to get us started, the first thing I thought I would do is we've got some things that we've asked them both to talk about, but I think really it would be awesome to hear from both of them just first about how you got to your current career. Like, is there a path or journey that got you to the place you're at now? Maybe just touch on that a little bit, and then we'll ask some other questions too. And either one can start. So,
I'll go first. Hi, I grew up in the Randolph area. I'm sure all of you have ventured over to the Randolph area. And I wasn't a college-bound kid, but I did end up at Vermont Technical College, and I studied architectural engineering technology and sustainable design and technology. Received 2 Bachelor in Science degrees there, and went on. I worked for an architect and did a lot of public work projects. Worked for a solar company. I've done a lot of different things because that program is a building science program, very broad. But in my time in college, I got involved with, at the time, RASTA, and was getting into mountain biking and skiing. And it was all in my neighborhood, so I felt it was important to be involved. And as that's kind of evolved more and more, from 10 years ago, just the backcountry stuff. Now we've got 60 plus miles of trails between Pittsfield, Randolph, and Rochester that are being connected through a Vermont Trail project. I've now become much more involved in the club with the youth program development in the last 3 years, really strengthening that to create our next generation of stewards for these trail opportunities. And this is not my sole job. I wear multiple hats. The paid role I play for Ridgeline is a marketing and communications role, but otherwise everything I do outside of that is more in a volunteer capacity. And then, of course, I'm paid as a mountain bike coach, but a lot of what we've done is driven by volunteers, and we are just starting to shift into more paid roles. I think that's the hardest part about this sector is developing sustainability without destroying your base of support, which is volunteers in a lot of these infancy projects. And we were just talking about the Upper Valley group is 24 years old in there. And so they have 4 paid full-time positions now at this point, and we now are trying to wrap our heads around that level of sustainability for these sorts of opportunities, being that they've become a really big priority for a lot of folks. So long answer, but.
Thank you. Katie, how did you get to your career path?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I really got my start in outdoor recreation education in 2013. I took a job at a summer camp for kids where I was a residential cabin counselor, and it was about an hour and a half out of Salt Lake City. And it was the group that ran it was the largest school district in Salt Lake City that had 200 elementary schools alone. So just a massive school district. And they would send groups of 4th, 5th, 6th graders up to this camp for 3 days at a time to be with their classmates for the incoming year and their teachers for the incoming year. And they would do science lessons, outdoor education lessons, and a lot of different stuff during the day. And then the typical summer camp shenanigans at night, like your campfire program and different things. And I grew up going outside a lot. Like I mentioned that like the national parks were a very big part of my upbringing. And it wasn't until I worked at this summer camp that I realized that access to the outdoors is really, it's not accessible to everybody. There were a lot of kids who come from families who aren't as wealthy and didn't have enough time they didn't have a lot of free time to go outside or go hiking in the mountains or do all of that. And so this was like their first experience with nature, like the wild woods. It was their first time ever interacting with it. And because of where the camp was located, there was no cell phone reception, there was no internet. And so they were completely disconnected from phones and video games or television or whatever. And they just came to life. Like I remember distinctly, there was this group of girls. One of them stepped off the bus and she was wearing like designer heels and a very nice romper and had her hair all done up. And I was like, she's gonna have a very hard time at the camp this week. And within hours, she was like making mud pies with her friends and just totally unhinged. And it was amazing. It was just very transformative for the kids. And I realized like, I really want to do this for the rest of my life. Like I want to make sure that kids and just people in general have access to outdoor spaces and they have the opportunities to enjoy it. And so after I worked there, I went to school at Southern Utah University. And I studied psychology while I was there. I did not study outdoor recreation, which is a big regret of mine because the outdoor recreation degree there is amazing. So kind of kicked myself for that, but psychology's cool too. And I came out here because my husband got into medical school at Geisel, and that's where I was first introduced to the Trails Alliance, and I've been with the Trails Alliance ever since. So as far as my middle name goes, Danger was actually picked for me by the Upper Valley community. In 2020, we had to cancel all of our fundraising events that I'm in charge of planning for obvious reasons. You're in the midst of a pandemic, and so we couldn't put together our biggest fundraising events. And so I didn't have a middle name, and I decided to crowdsource one to raise money for the Trails Alliance. And how it started was I had a couple of names on the ballot, and then you could pay extra money to add a name. And then I closed that option, and then I had people vote every week until until we had a top two, and then the top two really went for it, and Danger won. So number two was Lark, which there are a lot of birders up here, so I kind of get it. I think people were like trying to be nice to me too. They're like this woman, you know, she's auctioning off her name. Like, I kind of want to pick a pretty one for her, but then everyone was like, no, Danger. That's it. So
how much did you raise with that effort?
we raised $5,200. So I was really happy, and it's on my driver's license. If you want to see it, it is real. It's legal. It's official. But now, you know, I mean, I was interviewed by a lot of papers, and for a while, if you Googled Vermont woman, my face came up. So I was like, Florida man, Vermont woman. But it's, you know, now it's something that I'll cherish forever as part of the Upper Valley, because people here picked it for me. So
I think that's such a great connection, and appreciate you giving us the backstory on it. I do think maybe going forward, what you might want to do is, as you share it, you could come up with a new reason why your middle name is Danger every time
Right.
somebody asks. So you have lots of stories about, you know, when you were ice climbing or.
yes. Oh, that's such a good idea.
Oh, well, thank you both. How I would like to pivot a little bit at this point and talk about really some of the bigger policy issues that are facing your organizations and the work that you're doing, and what techniques are you using to navigate those particular issues? And again, whoever wants to go.
I'll let you go first this time.
Sure. So some issues with our organization, the Upper Valley Trails Alliance, we are, our service area encompasses 43 towns in the Upper Valley, and every town has different laws and policies regarding outdoor recreation and trails. So oftentimes it is a bit of a challenge for us to know, okay, so we're working in this town, and this is the policy they have around this, or this is the policy they have around that. And additionally, every town has a different entity that is in charge of trails and recreation. So we have to know, how does this entity interact with, you know, the town or the community? How, like, what is their understanding of the policies? Like, how do they require we permit things, et cetera? And so that's always a challenge, because it's a lot to remember. There's, like I said, 43 different towns. Trying to remember exactly how every single one operates with their permitting and their policies, and just the process of getting a trail on the ground is a bit of a challenge. And also, I think another challenge that we have with policy is really related to, a lot of times people don't know that trails are a tool for conservation. A lot of times, I'll give an example. Let's say there's a town forest that the committee comes to my organization and says, we'd like you to put in a more established network of trails. And we say, okay, sure, like, we'll meet with you guys. We'll get some context about the property. We'll walk it with you. We'll kind of chart out some basic trails and see what's going on. And we'll start that process with them. But since it is a public parcel of land, the public has the right to know what's going on. And usually it's a spot that they've already been using the way it currently exists. And that creates some apprehension and some anxiety. They're like, how will this affect my use? How will this affect how I interact with the town forest? And so there have been a lot of times where we've started a project, and once people get word of it, they try to stop it, just dead in the water. They don't want it to happen. So they'll try to dig up some old policies, or they'll try to like research, like, how can I use an old town charter law? Can I use a conservation thing that will get in the way of this? And can I put a stop to it? So I'll talk about how we kind of navigate these issues later, but those, I think, are two of the biggest ones, especially since The Trails Alliance does not own any of the trails that we do work on. They're all managed and owned by different groups. So we don't get to make the decisions. We're just the ones that go in and do the work once the people who make decisions have decided that it's something that they want to do. So I think those are the biggest issues facing UVTA.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I nod my head to a lot of that sort of stuff, just navigating the different landowner partners you end up working with. And not 43 towns, but similarly, we're an umbrella over multiple areas and types of trail networks. So the backcountry usage is a little bit different from the multi-use. Most of our multi-use trails are very much mountain bike trail focused, but open for multi-use purposes. So there's that part of it, because you have private landowners, you've got public landowners, which are towns, and then you've got conservation. So U.S. Forest Service, New England Forestry Foundation, lots of different policies, even within those conservation organizations around what you can and cannot do in trail development. Another thing is just environmental policies. A big one for all trail organizations is, in this explosion of trail development in the state, how do policymakers navigate trails within Act 250 development and what that looks like? That's number one, I think, for a lot of us. Another one is just general, like, when is enough for trail development, and folks that may or may not be in support of what we're doing or have a different best interest in mind with how they like to use the land. Not wanting to push too hard on those folks, but also having to maybe deal with those folks coming out publicly with some concerns that may or may not be valid. And in facing those, I guess we'll talk about that a little bit, but the environmental side of it is still things that we're kind of learning as we grow these trail opportunities, and we're able to look at conditions in which, is this advantageous for the natural environment and the animals that exist there, or are we creating more of an issue? So, and also just, navigating, those sort of public, getting publicly pressed on things that we've got to kind of tactfully navigate, because everyone does have a different best interest in mind. Not everyone wants to ride mountain bikes on the trails around the area. And just having a lot of respect for that in a lot of these conversations, and make sure everyone's at the table in the policy discussion, not just the mountain bikers or not just the backcountry skiers, making sure that everyone is there and has a say in the process.
Thank you. I'd love to hear you talk about how you're facing some of these issues and how I would imagine there's a lot of coalition building. I imagine there's a lot of relationships and partnerships. And so I'd be curious to hear how you are navigating these particular difficulties.
Sure. Do you want to go first, Sam?
Yeah.
So a lot of times, like what you were saying, it is about building relationships. It is about understanding the context of the work that they are asking you to do. It's understanding the group that you're working with and the other groups that they're working with. It's understanding the community. And is this, what you're saying, is this what the community wants? Is this something that the trail users are interested in? That's always a very key part of moving forward with any projects like this, because the more you're informed, the more, the easier it is to get the project going, the easier it is to make sure that it happens. And also, educating the community on the work that you do is incredibly important. I mentioned earlier that trails are a tool for conservation. And a lot of times I think people see us with our big tools and our crews, and they're just gonna go up and they're gonna tear everything out, they're gonna chop down trees, they're gonna wreak havoc. But we try really hard to meet with people and explain that, if you put in an official trail, that gives people one path to enjoy the woods instead of just wandering around and stepping on all of the plants, possibly disturbing some ground nests, or, running into some animal dens. It's just a way for people to enjoy the woods in a more structured way and spare the ecology of the forest. And a lot of people don't think about that aspect. They don't know that you know what, actually me wandering around or me enjoying it how it is harmful because it just has existed the way that it has. So a way that we try to navigate that and we try to educate the community is going back to the example of the town forest. Let's say that we decide to do a community forum. There's enough people who are concerned about the work. They want to know more about the project. So we'll say, you know what, why don't you come to town hall or a public space on this day, and you can meet with us. You can meet with the commission or whoever asks us to do the work. And we will talk about what we plan on doing. We'll talk about how we plan on doing it in a safe, sustainable way. And then we'll turn it over to you for questions. And just doing something like that does so much to alleviate anxieties and help people understand exactly what you're doing. You know, we usually leave those community forums with a lot of people saying like, oh man, I had no idea that like, I hadn't even considered this aspect or I hadn't even considered this, or it just does a lot to help keep the community informed about something that they care a lot about. So another way that we try to combat that too is we don't just want to educate people in the towns that we work in. We also want to educate just trail users and outdoor recreation enthusiasts in general. And so to do that, we created a program called the Upper Valley High School Trail Corps program, where we take high school kids out on our trail projects and we teach them how to build and maintain trails. And the program does so much in teaching a new young rising generation just how much work goes into building and maintaining these spaces. It gives them a respect for the outdoors. It tells them how they should behave. And it also it prepares them to talk to their family and friends about how they can be responsible users as well. So just education about outdoor recreation overall does so much to combat these issues that I've talked about with policy and just helping the communities understand the work that you do and why it's important.
Yeah, I'll just echo that same thing. Education is so important around these trail networks and just maintaining them. And I guess since you touched on the ecological piece very well, I think, the more selfish-minded mountain biker in me wants to kind of, think about and share with you, in not educating the user around, the permissions we have in place, the work it takes to allow these trails to happen on private and public lands. I have my Ride with Gratitude hat on, and this is just kind of an initiative to get folks, trail users, to understand the resource in which we are integrating ourselves into, and that it's not just there for us to hike, ski, ride our bikes. There's a lot more to that than just the trail ecologically. And but I'm sure you've all heard of different instances where trail users were disrespectful to private landowners, and those private landowners who had been longtime partners of the organization or supporters, pulled themselves out of that, and it really changed the framework of the general trail network. In other cases, there's been situations where the trail stewardship team goes ahead with something, whether it be an individual or a group of folks that will go out on a trail, not necessarily understand the dynamics of the partnership with that landowner, and just as an excited volunteer that's out there getting work done and on the list and doing the great work, but all of a sudden they decide to pull some boards into the woods and build a little bridge. That happened in Mad River recently, and that shut a trail down because the landowner said, when was I supposed to hear about this after someone fell off the bridge on my property? That type of stuff that you really have to be thoughtful about from kind of a more selfish trail user perspective of, let's not spoil this for ourselves and everybody else, and make sure that education piece again. With the ecological side, we've been very diligent about making sure when those hard questions are asked, we take the steps to make sure we find the answers. So we worked with a group, it escapes me right now, but they did a pretty in-depth study on Brandon Gap, 3 of the zones. They put up cameras over 3 years' time and studied those zones. We now have a new cut glade zone in Chittenden Brook, but at the time that was a control. And they watched the wildlife action in those areas, and they actually found more wildlife traffic within the managed gladed zones than the control. So it was kind of, I don't want to say totally positive and say that everything's great, but it was kind of a neutral effect. And the graph showed that, the activity of the skiers and people in those woods kind of offset the activity of the bears and the different other animals that are more active in kind of the opposite time of year. So just having due diligence in getting good answers to those questions when they get brought to the table.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I'm so happy you brought up the ride with gratitude and thinking about, our own use on trails, because I know as someone who would go up to the Kingdom Trails and some of the landowners pulled out because of things that had happened, and it's a direct impact. And it's unfortunate because we want everyone to be able to enjoy them and be responsible, and be able to show the gratitude to the landowners.
Yeah, and it's an interesting place we're in now, where there's been a lot of people that want to come to Vermont and be in Vermont because of the expanded outdoor recreation opportunity, the safe haven that has been seen as by so many people through the last 3 to 5 years. So people want to be here. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in kind of the earlier days of these trail development opportunities, I think there was a little more awareness around that in the user, but now with such an influx of people that are coming here new to the area, but know that these opportunities exist, not really knowing the background of development, we need to even more be on top of that education piece for the user, because a lot of people could just come here with the feeling as if it's their playland, and that,
I can do whatever I want.
yeah, this person, who the hell is this person riding their horse on our trails? Well, that's the landowner for the 250-acre piece of land that you're riding on right now. So that sort of stuff is so important.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to people that are thinking about laws and policy in this area? What advice would you give them, and what's going to be necessary in terms of maintaining relationships and really building this work thoughtfully going forward?
I think my mantra, I'm more background is that I'm very much grew up in a community engaged oriented kind of mindset of existence always. So that's what's kind of drawn me back to wearing multiple hats, volunteer engagement, doing multiple jobs to make it work, to be engaged in these different arenas in my own community. My mantra has been that everyone has a different best interest in mind, and just maintaining that as your base of any conversation, and making sure that, you leave your agenda off to the side before you really understand, come to understand who's at the table with you before you present your agenda, whether you're advocating for a trail user, a trail owner, a landowner, a policymaker, depending on who you might be working with around this sort of topic. Everyone has a different best interest in mind.
Thank you.
I'm totally agree with you on that, especially for people who are interested in working for a more local organization or going somewhere and working for like a small nonprofit or something that is just very much a big part of the community. My first bit of advice is kind of what I said is part of the technique of navigating our issues, is just working to understand the groups that you interact with goes very far in helping make sure that like your mission is accomplished, your work is done to an extent that like keeps the community happy with you. So doing your research, like before you go to a meeting with anybody, if they're an entity that you're unfamiliar with, like trying to read up on some history about them, trying to understand their organization, going in with questions, like that's always a good idea. And also I would just say on a more personal note, like trying to become a member of the community, like trying to be an active member of the community and supporting these groups. Like a lot of times these groups have little events that they put on. So go to the snowshoe hike that the Land Trust is putting on, or go to the parks department's farmers market, say yes to being on a law panel at the school that's like a town away, like just try to be an engaged member of the community, and people will trust you. People will feel like you care, that you're there to support them, and that you have their best interests at heart. So I feel like that's just good advice for anybody who wants to do something more local, is just try to be personal with people, try to do your research and understand their group and develop relationships.
I just have a question for the folks that are here physically. How many of you are new to Vermont and being here at the law school? Cool-ish. Yeah, my advice meeting so many new people, even more so in the last 3 years, but anytime I meet someone new to this area, the 2 pieces of advice, which you totally just touched on, was you have to have a hobby if you're going to live in these parts. And you need to be involved. And that's really how that can be a couple make or break parts of a human being as to whether or not they're willing to stay around in Vermont, and especially the more rural areas further away from the interstate you get, the more hobbies you should have.
That's a very good point. That is sound advice.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say, we're so happy you're both here for this event. And you've kind of reached out to the audience. So I want to do that also. We want to have questions. So I will invite questions from the audience. And I think we have, Mackenzie has a microphone.
All right, yeah. Hi, thank you both for coming and doing this. My question is sort of related to private landowners. I know that Vermont there are both for lack of a better term, the NIMBYs who don't want anything going on in their backyard, and there are people who maybe think that they can do it better. How do you navigate private landowners managing public trails that intersect with their land?
You need to get the private landowner's permission. And so the delineation of that really is, if someone buys a piece of property, this is an example of maybe what you're speaking to. Someone buys a piece of property that abuts a town land. And, that trail's been there forever. It was the organic kind of trail crew before they had to really formalize, and I call it CYA policy, cover your ass. So, get those policies in place to make sure that we're not spoiling this for ourselves or destroying all this work we put in. That person in buying that piece of property, realizing, hey, there's this kind of public trail that crosses my land, but I don't really want it here. They'd have to then look at, the deed for the property, and if the landowner prior to them didn't put in any sort of either 10-year agreement or an easement for that trail, they have every right to say, I do not want a trail on my property, and respectfully, as a representative or whoever it is with that landowner, you very well better say, thank you very much for letting us know. And there may be opportunities to try to change their mind, but I think out of respect for everyone's different best interest, not doing that. But that's a big part of kind of what we're trying to do more of is make sure there's a better understanding. Right now we're working with the Vermont Trail Project. Have you all heard of that? It's a through state trail network for multi-use, more skiing, biking focused, but it's a hut-to-hut trail network, working with Vermont Huts. That's something in working with them right now. It's kind of coming through. A big part of it is getting completed through the Pittsfield, Rochester, Randolph area. I have maps if anyone's interested in that stuff on the table, just to see geographically how that's laying out and playing out, because it's a really awesome project. But the student he's a student at UVM, but he's also doing this part-time with the Vermont Trails. He's doing the kind of landowner relations. And so right now we do have grant funding that has been secured for a certain section of this trail development, connecting parts of our trail network for this greater project. So we are thoughtfully kind of developing the approach with this landowner as this project develops in 10-year agreement versus if they're interested in a 10-year agreement and hopefully an easement for that trail on their property. But otherwise, a lot of these trails have been developed over the years with handshake, and then we turn into those situations where there's a change in hands of the land and saying, the NIMBY thing is definitely a thing, but out of respect for everyone's different best interests, we try our best to have respect for those that don't want it in their backyard, and that's completely fine.
Right. And actually, you reminded me of something which another issue is when you have somebody who buys a piece of land that has an easement on it. And
approaching them.
Approaching them. I've had a couple of people who there's one story in particular where there was this person who was coming from out of state and was interested in purchasing a house that had a lot of acreage on it, and part of that had a trail that ran through it. And I'm not quite sure who to blame here for not informing them on the fact that there was a trail easement on that trail. But I think the person purchased the trail, or like their house and their property, with the understanding that nobody's going to use it. I'm just going to shut it down. I'm just going to let it overgrow. And it was actually like a very bustling trail, like right next to town, and people use it a lot. And they got really frustrated, and they approached the town and said, why are there so many people using this trail? And I don't get it. And they said, well, actually, this has been an established trail for a long time, and there's an easement on it that's good for 50 years. It was a really long time that they had this easement in place. And the person was still just not understanding what an easement was, why they couldn't just get rid of the trail. And I'll never forget this day. This was a very interesting day in my career. I got a call from somebody in town saying this person is smearing dog poop on the trees next to the trail. And we're like, what? Wait, what? And it got to that point where they did not want people there so badly that they started putting dog poop on the trees to deter people from using the trail. And so we had to have a conversation and had to have we met with the town, and we met with the person just to have a conversation saying it might have been during the real estate transaction that the previous owner did not communicate very clearly what was going on, but this is what's happening. If you want to dispute this trail easement, it's going to be very hard to do. It's going to take a long time. So is there an agreement that we can reach? Is there something that we can do to make you feel better about people using this trail? And it really came down to they just did not like that people could see their house from the trail. So the town offered to plant some shrubs and block the view, and they're like, I'm satisfied with that. So that was the resolution to that. But it created quite an issue, not understanding the trail easement in place and knowing, actually it's here for a long time, and it's here because people use this trail. So that's an important thing, that if you are somebody who puts an easement on your property, or if you know about it, if you're helping somebody purchase a property with that easement, you really need to inform the person who is buying the property what it means and what they're expected to do with the trail easement and what it means for the town. So,
thank you. And I'll just take a moderator privilege to recognize how important it is to ask people what they want and need in situations, because that's the best way that you can respond to something that they might be really upset about. Very restorative. So I love that. Other questions?
Hi. So I'm one of those out-of-staters. I'm from Florida, and coming up here, I'm living on a homestead. So I'm living with a Vermonter, and I remember the first time I asked her, "Hey, I want to go hiking. I really want to go hit a trail," and she goes, "Well, just go into the forest outside." And I was like, "No, I need a trail." And she was like, "No, in Vermont, we just go, we just walk into the woods." And then she sent me off to a community forest, and it was so hard. And then I was explained that Vermont has such a different take on hiking here compared to the South. And I was just wondering, is there a way to sort of get oriented around here? And maybe just I just am completely oblivious to the trail system here and access to the formal trails here and just where I could figure that out. And yeah, so
Well, the first question I have is this homesteading Vermonter. How long have they been in Vermont? Because that is
not it. They've been here for like 20 years.
okay. So everyone does have a different idea of that for sure.
Yep.
So interesting. But yes, there's a couple different ways of being outdoors. Orienteering is that kind of method. It sounds like she was pointing you towards. But there are a couple different really great trail apps. All Trails is one. Trail Forks is another. And Trail Forks is really great because it drops a pin of where you are on the trail network map, and you can go around in there. And if you're in the Randolph area, if you're in South Royalton, there'll be trails that are, and those are all trails that you're allowed to go explore because they're on a published map. So, just to make sure where you're going to feel comfortable, but also to know, where you're going, where you're allowed to be, rather than just wandering out into the woods. And the other one that we use for the backcountry trail stuff is Avenza Maps. And so we have trail maps for the Brandon and Braintree backcountry on our websites that you can download and open in those apps. Same thing, geolocation. We have had issues where we have in the center of one of our backcountry networks a private landowner and conserved land, 1,500 acres around him. And we as a club failed to really have due diligence around educating folks to know where you are, know where you're going. And there was some controversy around that. Any of those trail apps are awesome, especially for anyone that's not really familiar with paper map using orienteering. Those work when you don't have cell service as well, those geolocation apps. So
I'd like to add one too. The Upper Valley Trails Alliance, I'm going to do a little plug here.
Yeah.
The Upper Valley Trails Alliance, we manage a software called Trail Finder.
Oh, yes.
And Trail Finder is so we set up Trail Finder so that all of the maps and all of the information that's on the trail posting is all approved by the landowner and the entity that manages it. So if you're looking for really detailed information and maps on especially Upper Valley trails, I definitely recommend Trail Finder. And I think it's a website right now. I think they're trying to raise money to make it an app, but it's trailfinder.info. And you can find tons of networks and trails. You can search by use, you can search by distance or difficulty. There's a lot of stuff on there. So
okay, thank you so much. And it was Fenza with a V?
Oh, it's I have to write it. It's Avenza.
Okay.
And it's something downloaded on your phone, and then go to the website and download the link to it. If you have any trouble, email info@Ridgeline Outdoor Collective. But the Trail Finder too, just for the broader audience of trail user, is a really awesome resource. But Avenza is a lot of environmental resource folks use that as well.
yeah.
And yeah.
So, thank you.
Other questions?
Well, also I want to say welcome to the Upper Valley.
Thanks.
Yeah, we hope you stay.
Yeah.
Don't get lost in the woods. You won't.
Thank you. I believe you.
Promise.
Sorry, go ahead.
Morgan, you mentioned Act 250, and I kind of think of Act 250 as like a development act. I was just wondering if you could kind of expand on how it interacts with trail building and the work that you're doing.
I think that's just generally the question is, as the trails continue to develop, how does this sort of process of development, does it fit within that defined kind of policy? And how might we need to revisit the specifics of that to make sure we delineate, a square footage of trail versus a square footage of parking lot development, or that sort of. So I think it's just kind of navigating that. Do you have any?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just going to say the same thing, that it's really dependent on the scope of the trail project, like the overall size, but it's hard to gauge because, like you were saying, like how do you compare, a Walmart and the parking lot associated with Walmart compared to a trail network. So I think it is very dependent on the scope of the project. If it's like a massive, massive thing, sometimes it can trigger Act 250. But it's very complicated right now.
And there's like different trail development processes that are hand-built trail networks versus machine-built trail networks.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of level of scale too, as to where does this relate to this, or does it not at all in development terms?
Yeah. So far, I'm just, from what I've experienced with Act 250, it's all about personal opinion. Like who thinks it really is triggering Act 250 and who doesn't think it is. The people who, it's very interesting, especially like you're totally right. In the last few years, as trail projects and like outdoor recreation has exploded after the pandemic, like it's really become more of it's not so cut and dry with trails and outdoor recreation as much as it is for like businesses and big developments like that. So I wish I had a better answer, but.
Well, that's another piece of advice for you all, like going into this field potentially, is to, maybe that becomes a passion project of yours in the midst of your kind of education process here, and join in on that to get a better understanding of how we all in the industry are trying to navigate that ourselves.
Yeah, become part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Other questions?
My question is about, you mentioned looking at wildlife and comparing wildlife on kind of control lands versus ones that have been maintained with trails. And I know that there's been studies with tracking wildlife with like bridges over highways and how wildlife uses trails and corridors themselves. So I was wondering if you've done any research on that, or what you'd have to.
Yeah, that's what that project was. And I actually just wrote down to forward that video to Mackenzie to share with you all. And great study and a great kind of panel type conversation like this around how they actually did that study and kind of approached the best practice for it, and just kind of how they disseminated the data of, it's not necessarily good or bad, but and then there's been, I think, more around the mountain bike side of things in terms of being a little more strategic in that sort of study of usage and what type of trail development it is, whether it's a hand-built trail or a machine-built trail. What do you think?
So would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, I was more just kind of if you could speak to that, if there have been other studies. And then the other thing I was thinking of I've done some work with pollinators and creating pollinator corridors with plants, and whether that's something that trails could be used for, like not just for people, but, we need to connect, these two populations through trails. Just kind of any experience you've had with that or commenting on it.
Sure. So this is kind of a research project that I was involved in college, and I'm not sure if it got published or not. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to find it anywhere. I kind of had to leave it abruptly. But I was part of a team. This was for an environmental psychology class that I was part of, where the professor was asked by some of the different Utah state parks they were like, there are some native species that we're not seeing anymore. And we're wondering what's going on. Like, can you guys come in and do some work, try to figure out what's going on? And the reason why they asked my professor is because he specializes in soundscapes. So he has like a lot of very high-tech recording equipment that he hikes out to very remote places. He sets up a recording device for like months at a time, and then goes out and collects that data, puts in another blank tape, brings it back. And then my job was listening to hours of audio and cataloging what we heard. And I came onto this project, I think it was the third or fourth year that they had been collecting soundscapes out of Zion National Park. And he had discovered over those years that you heard less animals the more helicopter tours that they did. and you heard less animals around the busier, more populated trails. And so he said, like, you know what, actually there is something to this. Like, animals are afraid of loud noises. They're afraid of they're afraid of noises that they're not familiar with. And so if you want to see them back, if you want them to come back to the environments and back to their ecosystems, then you need to be better at informing users in the parks, and maybe you need to stop doing helicopter tours. And I think that's when the parks really started cracking down, especially on portable speakers. I'm just going to say I absolutely hate portable speakers. It's just not, it's very damaging, and I don't think people realize it's damaging. So just use your headphones, or one headphone, so that you can hear other things going on around you. But it scares animals away. And so that's something that I try to do a lot now that I was involved with it, is when I talk to people, I try to say, like, you know, it's good to clap and let animals know that you're there, but you don't want to be so disruptive that they're scared and they don't come back. So that's just kind of a piece about, like, interacting with wildlife and the trails, is that you need to be conscious as a user of how you're behaving and how that affects the animals and the environments around you. Not sure if that answered your question or not, but it's just my insight on it.
It's interesting. That makes me think of during when everything went kind of into lockdown in the pandemic. I live with trails kind of really in my backyard, which is, you know, incredible. And I had a pod of friends that we were in our pod, right? So we knew we could see each other once a week, and we would go on the trails. But I think everyone in town did that. And I remember thinking at one point, it's quieter in the woods. I don't even know how else to say it, but even with deer, I mean, we see deer, turkey, like, you know, and just all over, and bears. But I think about that time now, and I remember thinking, we're all out here. And they have, like, pushed back to somewhere else because there's too many of us in their space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think, question. Yeah. Fallon.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the funding piece. Like, how much of this is advocacy work that you're doing with policymakers to actually designate funds to this, or grant writing or fundraising, and like private lands donated versus public lands? If you could just speak a little bit to that, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
I guess I'll start out on it. It's a lot of money recently that's coming down through funding that is available. It's just navigating, you know, what sort of availability we have as a board and as a body of folks to do that. Being that Ridgeline, we have one part-time paid position, and I am a quarter-time paid position, I would say, maybe less. I think that creates some pretty serious strain on what we do. But, you know, more recently, we've seen a lot more money and support for these trail development projects. And a lot of that funding supports the due diligence of the ecological studies prior to the development. So there's a lot around being able to use these funds and steps that you must take before development can take place, and different studies that you do have to have in place prior to even starting a bidding process for your trail builders to come in and do that development if it's that scale of a project. Getting unrestricted funds is really great, because then we don't have to go through a bidding process and we can just get straight to work. Still thinking about the due diligence of just our responsibility in that development process. But yeah, it's just been interesting too, with all the different types of trail clubs and trail alliances and trail groups, and then the different umbrella organizations, like the Catamount Trail Association is a winter organization that we are a chapter under for the backcountry stuff. And then Vermont Mountain Bike Association is the chapter organization in which we exist as, or it's an umbrella organization in which we're a chapter. And I think there's about 26. Are you under the VIMBA umbrella as well?
I might be.
Vermont Mountain Bike Association? Yeah.
Maybe I am. I'm not sure.
I think your chapter probably, I think you're probably a chapter under, but it's like 26 chapters for that. Yeah, I think just trying to balance ourselves and look forward into sustainability, strategic planning, now that we're realizing how much this is in demand and the work that we're doing, and just really being thoughtful, putting energy into the youth programming to look at the next generation of stewards. There's been earlier iterations of these types of efforts in the Randolph area of trail clubs, trail organizations. And the reason in the 90s that kind of had to get shut down was because a lot of land permissions weren't in place. There's a lot of work, a lot of good similar-minded folks to us in developing trails and whatever, but it was in the 90s before mountain biking was like an economic driver for communities, which is a crazy idea, but it's bringing people to communities that want to live there and be a part of it, when at that point in time, it was people taking bikes where they weren't really supposed to traditionally take bicycles. So we used to host the Pedro's Mountain Bike Festival in our area, which was a pretty big deal in the Randolph area. There was tons of people that used to come. Maps were developed, permissions for that event to use these kind of ad hoc backwoods, woods, roads, trails. And the event ended. The trails maps were still in people's hands, and people just started to keep coming back and kept coming back and kept coming back. So the funding piece is one thing, and then just strategy is the other side, with all the things that we discussed in making sure that we are sustaining not only the work, but also the strategies around maintaining all of this stuff.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And as far as like anything on the federal level, like any federal grants are going to be very competitive because there's so many people who are applying for them. And they almost get to the point where they have such very specific criteria to try and like funnel down the amount of people who want it. So I would recommend, as far as securing funding for things, trying to find something local again, because there's somebody who probably enjoys the trails. And there are a lot of companies and local businesses that have give back programs. They have grants, or they have like an annual Christmas gift or a holiday gift that they want to give to a nonprofit organization, or they have an incentive for their employees to give. It's doing your research again to figure out what those are with your local businesses and groups, and applying for them, and also appealing to people who have money that they want to donate. Like the Upper Valley is a big retirement community, and there are, in some places, and there are a lot of people who have money that they want to donate and do some philanthropic giving. And so trying to find those people who are like, if you care about the outdoors and you have money that you'd like to donate, like here's trying to foster that relationship with them. So anyway, I guess as far as like the funding goes, federal or state, sometimes they're like very competitive because of just the amount of people that they're reaching. So trying to find something a bit more local, we might have better success.
It's something we just shared a similar sentiment on earlier is, I as we're developing our paid positions and looking at what it takes to keep the lights on now as a nonprofit for us, being an organization that's 24 years old versus 10 years old, and they have 4 full-time positions where we're still developing that. She still shared the same thing that we share, is like, it's amazing we've been able to maintain this for so long. It's just kind of year after year, we chase the funds and they come, and the support is always so humbling to see the people that come forward when we do these different funding campaign strategies or sponsorships. That we've had many sponsors that we haven't even solicited that just know our work, and they send us money, and it's a wonderful thing. But also figuring out ways that these sorts of organizations can be better sustained in the future. We're all, as organizations, I think there's a lot more going on around networking within these types of organizations around, how do you all do that? What's your strategy? Or, tell us your worst landowner partnership story. Like that sort of stuff is always such a good learning experience because of the nature geographically of the different zones and areas that we all go play in, and learn about the different chapters and whatnot. Support your local chapters. If you're into the trail usage, if you're into a certain aspect of the outdoor recreation, get involved in that. And I think
No
that's
gift is too small is the
Totally.
thing. Like
Yeah.
there's like we do like a membership program where if people become a member and they get discounts to our events, they can borrow tools from our tool shed through the lending program. There are a lot of benefits for it. And the basic fee is like $30. But that $30 does a lot to sustain our work. And so I think a lot of times people think like, I can't give a lot, so I shouldn't give it all. Totally false. Like nonprofits and local groups will accept whatever you are willing to give and be so grateful for it. And I just wanted to expound on kind of what you were saying, like how do you sustain things? How do you keep things going? You have to be comfortable asking. Like part of my job, especially with the Passport to Winter Fund, I ask a lot of businesses to donate prizes to these kids free of charge to them. I got to ask a lot of people for free stuff. So you just got to be comfortable like asking like, hey, like, what do you think you can give? Like, I think your group, resonates with us in this way. Like, what can you offer? And you just got to be comfortable asking for stuff. So
Yeah, I think being like community oriented and just thinking about it just escaped me so quickly, but I think anyways, giving back to those organizations, we just as much give back to you all with the coupons and the experiences that you get from the opportunities in those places. Probably popped back in my head like right before we finished, but oh yes, that was the thing. It was right here. I think just something for you all to think about kind of in what area of policy you decide to explore. I think something that I kind of had a good understanding of at a young age, just getting involved in the community was, working for a nonprofit. There's kind of this unspoken understanding that if you're going to be working in a nonprofit, you are also going to be working to secure your job. So like a lot of the work you do within a nonprofit is making sure the funding is there. And some nonprofits do have fortunate position to have a dedicated person for that, which is, shows great stride and development and forethought. But just knowing that if that's a passion of yours, nonprofit organizations just kind of have that there in the forefront of your mind. So it's not a jarring feeling to be like, what do you mean I have to find the money to sustain my job? Like that's just kind of a little bit of the reality of the world of nonprofit. So, being humble in that nature as well as you enter the workforce or apply your passion.
yeah, I think very few people go into the nonprofit space with the intention of making a lot of money. It's mostly
Or any money at all.
Yeah, it's mostly because you care about the cause. So
Do we have maybe one last question, or are we at time? That's what I was thinking too. So I will take this moment then to say thank you to Morgan and to Katie. And I want to give also thanks to Bill, Brian, cafe staff, everybody. Can we have a round of applause?
I think I learned just as much as you all did because this was a wonderful thing. So thank you
thank
for
you.
hosting.
Yeah, I learned a lot from you too. So
Yeah.
thank you for having us. Had a great time. If anyone wants to come up and ask us questions, we'll stick around for a little bit, or I will.
Yeah. I brought some maps and stuff. I'm sure we'll totally. This is what we do: is we just hype the organizations.
So
Thank you.
thank you.